Years after the beginning of the full-scale war, are we closer to the just war than we were in 2022? I'm Yana Brenzei, and I will be moderating this conference. We will be working in English, so please make sure that you have headsets for simultaneous interpretation. But before we start, I would like to introduce our panel to you. Our special guest, General David PETRAEUS, member of the KSF Security Council, commander of U.S. Central Command 2008 to 2010, and director of the United States Central Intelligence Agency 2011-2012, one of the most reputed American military people on the planet Earth, as it were. Please give him a round of applause. And we have Ms. Natalka, Ambassador of Canada to Ukraine. This year, Canada has presidency in G7, and we hope that it will remain G7 and not G8. We will speak about that later. Katarína, MATHERNOVA, Ambassador of the European Union to Ukraine, who has dedicated years of her life to establishing and improving the relationship between the EU and Ukraine. Mr. Patrick Turner, Senior NATO Representative and Head of NATO Representation in Ukraine, ex-Assistant Secretary General of NATO, and Mr. Arseniy YATSENYUK, Chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum, Prime Minister of Ukraine in 2014-2016, the person who headed the Ukrainian government when this war started.
When Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, it was obvious to the US who the aggressor was. For example, Marco Rubio, who was a senator then, wrote that Putin was an expert liar who would accept ceasefire only if he saw some benefit, it's quote. Now we see that situation is shifting dramatically. President Trump blamed Ukraine for the war which ongoing on our soil. So, General PETRAEUS, considering this, how do you envision Trump's plan, peace plan? How can we understand it?
Well, I would start actually by referring to what Secretary of State Rubio now, former Senator Rubio, said around the meeting that took place in Saudi Arabia between the Russian and U.S. delegations, and announced that the goal of the ceasefire discussions is a just and enduring peace. And I think that's exactly what all of us would like to see. Look, I'd like to have seen it under other terms, where we would have provided so much assistance to Ukraine, all of us together, that Ukraine would have been able to retake more of the territory that Russia controlled at the very height of this invasion. But I want to actually start by saying this is my 5th trip here just since the latest war began. I was previously in the Donbass back in 2019. I've watched Ukraine's professionalization. The first time I was actually in Ukraine, it was still a Soviet republic. I was with the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, who was making the first trip to Ukraine since General George C. Marshall went to Yalta in the final year of World War II. And so I've literally watched it from a time when it was very, very dark to a time where it has been flourishing. I've watched the ups and downs with admiration for those who were in the Maidan and leading the country at difficult times. And I think the transformation, not just of the country, but really of the forces of Ukraine, has been nothing short of breathtaking. I've been coming enough now that I can actually see from visit to visit. For example, last September when I was here, we visited the Nemesis Battalion. This is a great drone battalion. It's doing some of the operational level work, not tactical, not strategic. They're now a regiment already. This only was formed a year and a bit ago. To see the progression in unmanned systems. Part of this week was spent at the Brave One Defense Technology Conference. Again, stunning. This takes place nowhere else in the world. And it's been done largely by Ukrainians. The partnership in Ukraine between those who design the unmanned systems, and of course it's not just aerial unmanned systems, it's maritime systems, it's ground systems and so forth. The partnership between those who design them, those who manufacture and assemble them, and those who employ them is like this. The constant refinement, improvement, iteration, not just software, which isn't too hard, but hardware is astonishing. We spent time this trip with an assault brigade that you all will know well at its training facility. And, you know, they weren't training infantrymen, they were training pilots for, again, ground and air unmanned systems. And that is what has enabled Ukraine, in addition to the tenacity, the courage, the innovativeness, the determination, that's what has enabled Ukraine to keep Russia from taking Kyiv in the very beginning. And I want it noted on the record that I was asked right after Russia invaded how long it would take for Russia to take Kyiv. And I said, I don't think this is going to happen. Again, I've watched over the years. I had Ukrainian forces under my command in Iraq when I was the commander there. As an airborne brigade commander, we had Ukrainian forces come jump with us at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. We then came back here. So I think it's very, very important to not get overly seized by the latest tweet or whatever we call what's on X now, or truths or whatever. Certainly read that, follow it, but let's stay calm about all of this. Let's make sure that we're all devoted to ensuring the sovereignty, the independence of Ukraine, a country that was brutally invaded without provocation, barbaric actions, all of us who have been to Bucha and so forth. Keep that in perspective. Keep in perspective the fact that we share values and principles. We hold them dear, in fact. And that's why we have provided so much assistance from the United States, and why the other NATO and European and Western countries have done the same. I do want to see this get calm. Let's start all horses pulling in the same direction. Try to achieve what Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has said we want to achieve. And again, even though it's not what we all hoped it might be, it is so vastly better than what so many of the doubters predicted almost 3 years ago.
But according to President Zelensky, like a third part of Ukrainian defensive capabilities now depends on the US help, US aid. Can we rely on it? How do you think this year, the next years of this war?
Well, I was just at the Munich Security Conference before coming here, and I met with a number of, there was a very large congressional delegation from the US. That's often, it's a metric actually that Europeans watch. It's very, very important. And a number of the senior senators were there. I was actually part of the congressional delegation, if you will, although I came and went separately. But I sat down with Senator Lindsey Graham, who's very close to President Trump, with a number of the others, Republican and Democratic House of Representatives members. They didn't come to Munich to say that we're not going to support. They're there to show their support. And I think it's that there is bipartisan consensus on the imperative of continuing to provide support to Ukraine. And of course, we have provided a vast amount of security assistance, more than all the other countries put together, although we should credit the other NATO and EU countries with providing more overall, slightly more if you add financial, economic, and humanitarian assistance to the security assistance. And it is clear that in certain categories, particularly in anti-ballistic missile defense, some other air defense categories, and a handful of other items, the U.S. really is unique in being able to provide those. But as I mentioned, what Ukraine has done itself, it is making virtually everything. Ukraine made more howitzers last year, 155 millimeter howitzers, than all of those that were given to them. So we just need to continue to enable Ukraine and enable it to do what it has demonstrated so impressively which is incredible innovation. Keep in mind that Ukraine has a procurement system, if you will, that is providing tomorrow's technology for today's war. In many respects, in most other countries, because of the length of time that it takes for the materials, the requirements process, testing, procurement, manufacture, etc., we end up with yesterday's technology for tomorrow's war. Yes, we do create some pretty extraordinary weapon systems like aircraft carriers and F-35s and all the rest of that. But this is the future of war right here in Ukraine. It is unmanned systems. And over time, it's going to become not remotely piloted, but autonomously piloted as artificial intelligence and so forth become more and more and more ubiquitous in this process. So again, I strongly believe in the need to continue to provide assistance to Ukraine. I am in awe of what Ukrainian forces have done. I was privileged, in fact, this morning to talk to the staff and war college students who have so much combat experience, obviously. But what Ukraine is doing is walking point. It's pioneering, again, the development of systems that increasingly will be the future of war. I was talking to, again, a leader of one of the drone units, and he said, you know, we're starting to think there may come a future in which there's no front line because the front line is so lethal. You literally cannot survive out there. There's drones on top of you all the time. And again, to be able to produce 1.5 million drones here in Ukraine in a single year is, again, nothing short of astonishing and breathtaking. But before I end on this one, if I could, I feel it incumbent on me to congratulate the ambassador from Canada on her hockey team beating the U.S. hockey team by 1 goal in overtime in a very thrilling game. But that, if I could, reminds me of when I went to Canada when I was a 4-star general, either in Iraq or Afghanistan or something, and I was presented a hockey jersey of Canada because you had just beaten us in the Olympics. I was very happy the following spring to be able to present a miniature Stanley Cup. This is the trophy that the winning team gets in the National Hockey League, a Stanley Cup to the Minister of Defense, who kindly came out to visit and had presented me the jersey. But it had Boston Bruins on it. In other words, an American team. The only problem with that was he pointed out that all but 2 of the players on that team they're all Canadian, basically. But it's a great privilege to be here with, by the way, the others on stage, particularly your former Prime Minister. Every time I think of the Prime Minister, I recall a photo that is in his office, not too far from here, I think, which has, they're looking over the Maidan, and John McCain is standing beside him, someone who really devoted his life to the principles that this war is all about. And it really struck me that there were 2 heroes in that photo looking down at a huge number of Ukrainian patriots at a moment of incredible historic importance for this country.
Thank you, General PETRAEUS. I think we will back to the topic to talk about the situation, current situation on battlefield. But first, I want to talk with Mr. Mots, not about hockey. Unfortunately, I don't understand anything about this. It's the only thing that I understand about this. But let's back to the statements. President Trump also said that it had been a mistake to exclude Russia from G7 at 2014, G8 that moment. Is it possible to Putin to return to the group this year when Canada leading the G7? And speaking broadly, what consequences might the end of Russia's diplomatic isolation have, especially for justice? I'm asking this because Canada is one of the 44 countries who work on establishing the tribunal, which we called Putin Tribunal.
So, very happy to be here. Thank you very much. Oh, I think we all have to remember the reason why Russia was essentially kicked out of that group, and that was in 2014 for the annexation of Crimea. And the way I see it, the conditions have not changed, so Canada is not prepared to change the membership. So I think Canada will stand firm on that. I think that as the G7 presidency, we've made clear, the Foreign Minister Melanie Joly had a meeting on the side of the Munich Security Conference where they had Foreign Minister Andriy Sabiha there. So again, that speaks volumes that Ukraine is still very much central in the priorities. And I would say in two ways, very important to note. One is that it's still very important to work together as the G7 to increasingly support Ukraine in all kinds of ways, but two, to continue to put pressure on Russia, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's financial, economical, things like cap the oil prices, sanctions, I believe, are working, but I think it's going to continue to be a priority to make sure that they're stronger in newer areas and they're nimble, and address the circumvention of those sanctions as well. And I think this is where shadow fleets, for example, comes in. So I think they've made that clear that those are the two ways that the G7 group will continue to work and address the situation there. But I think the importance there is that it's still very strong in terms of support to Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine's bilateral approach has not changed. Just yesterday or 2 days yesterday, the Prime Minister had a conversation with President Zelensky, and he again reiterated everything that I have just said. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Ms. Maternova, this week all our eyes were in Riyadh, and now we see that not only Ukraine is being excluded from talks between the US and Russia about our own future, but the EU is in the same position. The US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, said that the EU wouldn't be a participant in the peace negotiation. And there were reaction from some officials, but I haven't seen the common reaction of the EU. Does the EU plan to respond for this? And how does the Union see its own security in case if the US reduces its involvement in Europe? Maybe the idea of European armed forces became a reality.
Thank you very much. Дякую за запрошення. It's an honor to be here. And I think I'm going to do a similar round as General PETRAEUS managed, and we'll talk about the heroism and the resilience and the determination and the awe-inspiring ability of Ukrainians to stand up to evil. Indeed, Europe was not there, Ukraine wasn't there, but let's go back to what you started with, sir, that Secretary of State spoke about just and sustainable peace. For just and sustainable peace, you will need Europe. And so at some point, if we take the noise out, we are, according to US representatives, at the beginning of the process. And we may not be flashy and exciting, we sometimes are boring, but we are stable, we are reliable, and we will come with the sustainable solution because the future of Ukraine is in Europe. It's simple just to look at the map. Ukraine has 4 days after the full-scale invasion, 4 days after, on the 24th, the Russians attacked. On the 28th, the country's leadership applied for membership in the European Union. Prime Minister knows, I had worked on Ukraine for close to 10 years now. And so I was we were trying to reallocate our money and get bulletproof vests here and try to work with our grantees and contractors to get emergency help. And in the middle of that, on the 28th, application to the EU came, and we were like, wait a second, you have other problems right now. You are ducking in bunkers and trying to avoid bullets, and you're thinking of EU membership, and it was really a paradigm shift to realize that future in the European Union is the hope that this country needs. This is the North Star that you follow to be able to put up this brave fight that you so far have. So I'm quite confident. I don't know which twists and turns it's going to go through, but the just and sustainability of it will lie with the European, with Europe, not only the European Union, but a broader European family. And let me reminisce for a second. I'm from Czechoslovakia. You probably might have read on my Facebook because I felt the need to say this after the events of this week. So the word Munich is sort of inscribed in our minds from mother's milk, that this was a historic mistake. It was an agreement about us, without us. And so for me, that's really unacceptable posture vis-à-vis Ukrainians. But there is one interesting element, and now I'm going to be very self-critical of our own history. I think that unlike my predecessors, the Czechs and Slovaks, I think the Ukrainians have agency and feel they have agency and are displaying their agency on a daily basis. So just like the reaction from not only the leadership, but in the social media from a lot of commentators is, we are not going to give up. What do you mean you are going to decide about us? You know, we are a country here that stands on its own. Yes, you need help. Yes, we will be here providing your help. And let me just say, the EU and member states are the largest donor, to the tune of over 140 billion euros until now, out of which over 50 billion is military assistance. So I think this is nothing to, these are orders of magnitude very, very comparable. And as I am looking personally at it's not an easy, very, very dramatically changing parameters of geopolitics. I think that Europe will actually need Ukraine for its own defense. So I very much see the development of the continent in this regard together.
Thank you so much. Mr. Turner, approximately a month ago, the German Minister of Defense said that Russia could attack NATO countries within the next 5 years. But at the Munich Security Conference, President Zelensky warned that it can happen much sooner. This year, Russia planned to deploy thousands of groups to Belarus. So my question is, are you sure that promise to protect every inch of NATO, like President Biden said, is still relevant and will kept?
So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor, and along with other colleagues, just to say this is an extraordinary country. You've done extraordinary things over the past 3 years. You've done far more than very many people would have expected, and you fought alone, but with a great deal of support from both the US and Europe. So your courage and determination is really an inspiration. I wanted to say a little bit from a NATO point of view, and I'll get to that, the good question. But over the last days, there've been, a set of meetings. They've been commented on, narrated, dissected, and I think in some respects there have been some misleading impressions. So in part I just want to set the record straight. But in looking back, one of the things NATO did last year was to publish, last week was to publish the figures for military assistance to Ukraine by NATO allies. The figure was a little bit over 50 billion euros provided by NATO allies. So this is some of the same money that the ambassador from the EU just quoted. But and of that 50 billion, roughly, according to the figures from NATO, 40% from the US, 60% from Canada and Europe. And the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has said it's essential that we really maximize assistance now to put Ukraine in the best possible position on the battlefield and therefore at the negotiating table. So just to be clear, NATO allies, and that's 32 allies, NATO brings together the United States, Canada, Europe. NATO allies collectively want to see the establishment of a just and lasting peace, and that was abundantly clear in the whole set of meetings that have taken place in Brussels and elsewhere over recent days. They want to assure that there can be no renewed Russian attack on Ukraine or an attack on NATO territory. So echoing other statements, including by members of the US administration, the NATO Secretary General said, for example, yesterday in Bratislava, there must be no Minsk III. It has to be an enduring and a lasting peace. And that's a message from the US, from European allies. It's a common message over recent days. So Ukraine and allies want a strong and a sustainable peace. To make a peace sustainable means security guarantees, and there's been the start of a serious discussion about that. The US and Europe have been discussing those in recent days. And we are confident, speaking from NATO, that there can be effective guarantees with Europe and the US working together. But it's also the case the US has asked European allies very clearly to step up much more. So on security in Europe, on defense spending, on support to Ukraine, on security guarantees for Ukraine, and to ensure fair burden sharing, because it's still the case that the US spends north of 3% of its GDP on defense, and on an average, European allies and Canada are a little over 2%. So at the moment, there is not equal burden sharing across the Atlantic. And European allies, and I think you've been hearing this in recent days, and some of them had been saying it before recent days, increasingly recognize that it's essential that they do step up much more. And that's both to ensure effective deterrence and defense in the coming years and to ensure sustainable peace here in Ukraine. So my boss, the NATO Secretary General, has been saying for months, we have reasonably effective deterrence and defense in the NATO area now. But looking ahead 3 or 5 years, we need to be doing much more now to make sure that it remains effective over that period. And that, the core goal of NATO is to ensure the security of its members. So to do that, European allies need much higher defense spending, much higher rates of production by defense industry, and it's clear that those higher rates are needed on both sides of the Atlantic. This isn't just a European shortfall, it's also an American shortfall. More and sustained support to Ukraine and a strong role in ensuring lasting security in Ukraine. So that is a challenge for European members of NATO, and it's a challenge which they will need to step up to, frankly, whether or not the new US administration were demanding that it's the case. It's needed for allies' own security. So in discussions in NATO and amongst allies, so in various places, in Munich, in Paris, in other settings, in recent days, there have been clear expressions of political will by European allies on all these requirements. And in the coming weeks and months, we have to give those expressions concrete reality. And I can assure you that the Secretary General will be working and is working very hard on this with all allies on both sides of the Atlantic. So summing up, what's clear is that both Europe and the United States have key interests at stake here. It's also clear they will be working together on those interests. Security cannot be guaranteed just by one or the other, but European allies must and they can step up and take more of the load and more of the lead. We all want to see a secure and prosperous future for this great country and for a great country which comes to be at peace. And we're committed, NATO allies are committed to working together to help bring that about. That's key for our shared security, for stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, the whole of it, and for global security, because other countries, China, North Korea, Iran, are watching extremely closely what happens here, and the outcome here needs to deter them rather than encourage them. So this matters for global security as well as security in this region. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
Yeah, some way, thank you. And in our case, North Korea and Iran aren't just watching, they are taking part, unfortunately. Mr. Yatsenyuk, Ukraine now is under enormous pressure. And for me, it's like a similar situation that we faced in 2014 when we have to explain what happened and to say who the aggressor is. Depending on your experience, how can we go through this diplomatic crisis, like a lot of people said?
Well, it's a billion-dollar question. You know?
Yes.
First, let me start with the thing that it's been 11 years since Russia waged the war against Ukraine. And it's been 3 years since Russia waged a full-fledged or unprecedented war against Ukraine. But we are in Kyiv right now. Not 3 days, it's even more than 3 days, okay? And I believe that we are a very grateful nation. So in your person, General, we want to thank the American people for your support. In your person, Madam Ambassador, we want to thank the people of the European Union for your support. In your person, Ambassador, we want to thank the entire NATO allies for your support. And in your person, Madam Ambassador, we want to thank G7, which is going to last forever, for your support. And you deserve applauses. And the Ukrainian military, which is represented right there, they deserve applauses. So, look, here is the thing. The easiest way and the wrong way is to apply tit-for-tat approach in current mess that is going on right now. I strongly disagree with this kind of approach. We have to be very smart and creative. Here is the dilemma. Either we want Trump to win or we want Putin to win. That's where we are right now. In my humble opinion, we believe that we want Trump to win because we want Ukraine to win. Correct? Correct. So let's do the smart approach. Provide to Americans what they ask for in order to get what we want to get. Yes, we are living in this kind of world. All of us have to be very proactive. So let me take a few minutes of the action plan that I envisage. I am not to lecture you folks, no. Just to share my take. So, if I were the president of the European Union, maybe the time will come.
We hope so.
It seems to me that the European Union has to be on the forefront. First and foremost, we need urgently to pass the House resolution in the European Parliament where the EU strongly supports Ukraine, increases the budgetary expenditure for the military procurement, provides a long-lasting security package for Ukraine, ask Americans to provide the same, ask Americans to provide the Lend-Lease, ask Americans not to decrease their expenditures, because you've had the rumors, the DoD already said that they are ready to decrease the military expenditures in their budget for practically 30%. And saying that, look, we are ready to buy your American weapon, but only in case if you provide Lend-Lease for Ukraine. We are ready to increase our military expenditures, but only in case if you do the same. It's a kind of reciprocity. The second, which is on the table, this is the Russian assets. Let me remind you that around 300 billion of Russian assets are still allocated in the European Union, not in the United States. Folks, be bold, okay? Don't be scared of Russians. If we want to prevail in this war, so we have to act. Europeans have to seize and liquidate these assets and to say to American president, look, Mr. President, we've done our job, now it's your turn. Seize your $5 billion. We are ready to share a certain amount of already seized assets with you via public procurements of ammo from the United States. And we are ready to cover some kind of expenditures in order to underpin and support Ukrainian economy. But you, Mr. President, have to do the same. The third issue, which is about sanctions. So the EU is doing its job. The EU is to extend every 6 months a sanction package. Correct? Correct. So the EU is to be very strong and to lead the process. If the EU decides to impose secondary sanctions on those who circumvent the sanction policy of the European Union and the United States, in this way, the EU is going to have an upper hand over the US administration, saying that, look, Mr. President, we've done our job. We expect from you to do the same. The next issue. I believe that our Canadian friends, and we are proud to have independent, sovereign, and strong Canada as an independent country forever, Madam Ambassador. Because you know that we have a huge Ukrainian diaspora. Yeah, just I want to tell you. Okay. So in current circumstances, there are some rumors hovering around the city that it's a kind of huge tension inside the G7, where the G7 is to pass a statement condemning the Russian aggression and blah, blah, blah. Okay. And that Americans are reluctant to pass this kind of language. Well, be on the offensive. Say, look, we are ready to pass a G7 decision with a clear-cut message from all G7 members that we are ready to increase the military expenditures. We are ready to support Ukraine. We are ready to purchase your ammo. Okay? We are ready to strengthen a number of multinational alliances that we have with you. And, Mr. President, it's up to you. You have to include this language into the statement. That's the way it works. And if you go public with this, just trust me, you're going to reach the target. And this is the way, actually, the political deal-making right now, which is very modern and popular in this new modern world, this is the way it works. The same goes with the NATO. So if you guys gather and say that, look, there is a gradual approach to increase our expenditures, and we strongly believe that the strongest military alliance in the world is NATO, will prevail in any war, and we're going to do our utmost to preserve this. And we have to rely on you Americans, and you have to do your part of the job. It could work too. In terms of Ukrainian roadmap, you are well aware, my fellow Ukrainians, that there are rumors, once again, and some kind of anecdotes about fresh presidential elections in Ukraine. The best way to pull the rug from under those who want to destabilize Ukraine is to pass a House resolution in the Ukrainian parliament. And I was very vocal 1 year ago about this. Let me remind you, and we have a distinguished members of the Ukrainian parliament, distinguished, the leaders of the prominent parties right there. So let me remind you that under the Ukrainian constitution, the only body that has the powers to set the date for the presidential elections is what? Ukrainian parliament. So the parliament can do its job because this is the will of the Ukrainian people. If you decide in a very clear manner in your House resolution to set the conditions for free and fair elections, which is very simple. Ukraine is to hold free and fair elections in 6 months after a comprehensive peace deal is achieved. Period. Period. And who's going to bark on this? And in this way, you give Trump cards to Trump, okay? And you actually pull the rug from under those who want to destabilize the situation, and Russians won't be happy. The same goes with this so-called mineral, whatever, that Americans want. Gosh. Okay, where do we want to have American investors? We would be happy to see them. But I am not sure, General, that we're going to see any American investor without ironclad security guarantees. Investors, they are not insane. They are not crazy folks, okay? So, in order to have a strong bilateral economic relations with the United States, I believe that our president is to sign MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, as not legally binding obligation, because it takes time, you know, to sign MOU. With the United States president, it resembles me Budapest Memorandum, okay? Saying that, look, Mr. President, we are ready for our mutual, strong, and beneficial cooperation. You want to invest in Ukraine? We want to see you in Ukraine. We want to share with you profits. We want to make you profitable and us profitable. And, Mr. President, we want not Ukraine to pay for the war that Russia waged against Ukraine, but we want Russia to pay for this war. Just to let you know. And then, in current circumstances, I believe that the Ukrainian parliament would support the incumbent president passing a House resolution saying that, look, we are ready to elaborate over the terms and conditions, because it's a very complicated process. One in DC can think that this is just a signature. No, that's not a signature. If this is a window dressing operation, so it's a signature. If it's just a kind of unrealistic approach, but we are very prudent, and we believe that this kind of deal has to be fulfilled. It means that this deal has to be on the floor in the House. And Ukrainian government is to hire American lawyers in order for American administration to realize the complexity of this issue, okay? And to cut the deal with the American administration. The reason why I'm telling, sorry that I taken such a long time, too boring for you. But the reason why am I telling you this? Because the situation, it's a watershed moment, okay? It's a make or break. America again, okay? And Ukraine too. Once again, we have to be very prudent and creative. And these dictators and autocrats like Putin is a very smart KGB operative. He can easily outplay, outcheat, outlast. And that's what he's doing right now. So, and I'm just wondering, whether he is so smart or we are so stupid. I don't believe that we are stupid. I believe we are smarter than him. And not only him, because he has close allies like China, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and the rest of these pariahs in the world. This challenge gives us a chance to become stronger and to win this war. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a few questions more, but after that, everyone will have, not of course everyone, but some of you will have an opportunity to ask our guests what you want. But firstly, I have questions. So, Mr. PETRAEUS, after 3 years of this war, on the one hand, we have an escalation of diplomatic pressure. On the other hand, we have a slow but persistent Russian offensive on the front line. How can you characterize the situation on the battlefield now, and how can it develop during this year?
Well, I think it's accurate to describe it by saying that it's difficult, but that what Ukraine has done to overcome the realities of being heavily outnumbered, heavily outgunned, is, again, as I mentioned earlier, hugely impressive. This transformation of how war is being fought, again, is led by Ukraine. By the way, the Russians are iterating as well. They're very good at electronic warfare, at jamming, at air defenses, all the rest of this. So it is a cat and mouse, if you will, back and forth. But Ukraine continues to develop very cutting-edge technologies that literally are not employed anywhere else in the world. And this is the future of warfare, as I've mentioned. And in that regard, again, when you visit the units themselves, you come away with not just enormous admiration for what they're doing, you come away with a degree of confidence. Now, this is by no means overconfidence. This is very, very difficult, as I mentioned. But all of these initiatives are enabling Ukraine to limit Russia to very incremental gains on a daily basis at enormous cost. You know, I had 5 combat commands as a general officer. By the way, 3 of those involved NATO positions. So I was in NATO commander as well as the U.S. commander, say in Afghanistan, or 3-star in Iraq, 1-star in Bosnia. And NATO, by the way, again, we very much want all of this, obviously, together. And frankly, I would like to see the kind of U.S. contribution that often establishes the foundation for these missions. That was the case in each of those 3 operational settings where I was privileged to be NATO as well. So what is going on here, again, you come away with a degree of calm, actually. You know, this used to be the case in Iraq in particular during the surge as well. People read the news back in the United States, and it sounds as if Iraq is about to disappear under the weight of the violence, and it was very, very tough. But when you're actually closer to it, you can see how it's being managed, and you can see the expertise of a combined force on the ground, again, and then aerial, ground, and maritime drones. You know, how does a country that has no navy, really, sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and force the final ship with a Russian color to withdraw from the centuries-occupied port of Sevastopol? it did it with Ukrainian technology. Drones, aerial drones that you design, manufacture, and employ, and then maritime drones. The aerial drones find the ships, and the maritime drones sink them. And I think you're going to see continued advances in this regard. Now, in these combat commands that I had over the years, just as a general officer, I wrote letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers just about every single night that I was in theater. And this is some 7-8 long period of time out of my final decade in uniform. I can't comprehend the size of the casualties that Russia has taken. The estimate is over 800,000 killed and wounded. And of those 800,000, 500,000 weren't able to return to the battlefield. In other words, they were so seriously wounded and killed that they could not be patched up and set back into the fight. This has to be worrying Putin. It was mentioned earlier, the economic sanctions are beginning to bite, and they should be tightened. Inflation is at very high levels. The interest rates are at such a level that nobody's going to borrow money and invest. The depletion of their workforce because of the numbers that are being recruited to go into service. Having to bring in 10,000 North Korean soldiers who they used as essentially just human cannon fodder, really. And in fact, on the front lines, the Russians really have begun to run out of tanks and some of the other systems, and they don't even use them near the front because they're getting knocked out so quickly by Ukrainian drones and anti-armor systems. And so they're literally fighting infantry soldiers, advancing a block or two in a day. Now, that is not reassuring. I wish that they weren't even achieving that kind of progress on a daily basis. But at the end of the day, what Ukraine has done in these circumstances is nothing short of miraculous. It's been a very long time since the Russians achieved anything of real note along the front lines. Pokrovsk is worrisome. That is something that is a bit of a rail and transportation hub. But then you look at what was done in Kursk, and Putin said, oh, they'll be out of there pretty soon, and they're still there. So, look, really tough, and I can very much share concern. I was an infantryman, and I can't imagine operating in this kind of condition where you're getting hammered on a daily basis by very large glide bombs. And even if you have great overhead cover and everything else, you're just getting stunned whenever one of those goes off. To do this in the snow, in these sub-freezing temperatures, then the mud will come. These are truly great Ukrainians. You know, after World War II, that generation of Americans that fought and saved democracy and free markets and so forth, that generation of soldiers was described as America's greatest generation. I believe that those who I was privileged to lead in the wars after 9/11, of Americans who volunteered to serve after our country was attacked so brutally, also deserve that title, America's new greatest generation. I think when this war is over and in the history books, historians and Ukrainians will look back and say that that was our greatest generation. Ukrainians, others in the world who cherish freedom and democracy, owe an incredible debt of gratitude to those who have fought on the front lines, to the families that have endured sacrifices, and really to all of the Ukrainians who have pitched in such an impressive manner to ensure that Russia has not been able to achieve its overall aims, the aims of a twisted, revisionist, revanchist view of history that is in the brain of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you so much for these words. Ms. Ambassador Tsmots, Canada has strongly supported Ukraine for these three years. And in your point of view, how the country changed in 2022, Ukraine I mean, and can we rely on Canada for your continuing support?
So I have the perspective that Russia already lost. I think if you look at the global goals of what it set out, then it hasn't achieved them. I doubt it's going to achieve them. But the problem is that Ukraine needs a lot more support in order to win, and that's a different question. But if you look at why do I say it lost? Because Ukraine's democracy, civil society is strong. And you can't lose sight of that. I mean, the reason why it wasn't taken in 3 days, communities didn't wait for the national army to come in. They didn't just sit there. They organized themselves. That's what you know of the Ukrainian people. They organize themselves. They support each other. It's amazing. So they have a democracy. They have a healthy parliamentary system. They have the civil society that is one of the most active I've ever seen. So it would be a very difficult country to occupy, given that they're not going to let it happen. And I think Russia knows that. So I think that's why we're supporting, not just militarily, of course that's important, but we want to make sure that we're continuing to support that spirit that Ukrainians have shown. And here I mean including in entrepreneurship, for example. I think that watching Ukrainians still start brand new small, medium enterprises. They're still opening up businesses. They're supporting their communities. They're staying in place. And I think that the economically resilience comes in the form of economics. And whether it's, Ukrainians staying put and opening up their own businesses, keep building, keep innovating, that's one thing. I do think that innovation and economic investment into the country makes a huge difference. So I think that's very important as well. We see that in all of our countries, that the more we're intertwined with each other with trade, the better we are. So you asked about where Canada's support is. I would like to see more of that trade relationship to be strengthened. We have a modernized trade agreement that was as of last June. So we now have the instrument to be able to help and work and continue to work with Ukraine as partners in those areas. I would like to see more of that investment in energy and defense procurement. I mean, it's a benefit. I believe it's a win-win for Canada and Ukraine and Europe as well. So I think we're going to continue along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Maternova, let's talk about another type of negotiation about Ukraine's future in the EU. Now it's looked like that the process ground to a halt because of Hungary's position. So what is the real perspective of accession negotiation with Ukraine this year? And if we talk about first cluster, fundamentals, do you have any concern about level of democracy in Ukraine during the war?
The process has not halted, has not ground to a halt. The process is going through what any process goes through. In order to accede to the European Union, we operate by unanimity, which, of course, if you dissect it every hour, every day of it, then you may see the setbacks, but the unanimity was there from the beginning, and we have proceeded quite far. So therefore, the unanimity was achieved, and I'm quite certain that we are going to achieve it on this one as well. We have been very consistently telling our Ukrainian friends that relationship with its neighbors are the most important, that one needs to take care of, one needs to understand the other's point of view. I realize that a time when you are so brutally attacked by your big neighbor, it's a moment where you're concentrated on yourself, but one needs to step out of that and understand the concern of the others and see where they're coming from, and there are ways to take those into account. So I'm quite certain that this is going to get open. We're not there yet, but we'll continue. But I would not want to over-dramatize the situation by calling it that it's halted to a ground. That looks different. we've been there. We'll get through it. We always do. So I think Ukraine has shown, and this is the other side of, we talked about the heroism and resilience, the determination on the battlefield, etc. But the one other area where Ukraine has shown ingenuity and determination and staying power is in the reform agenda. I would even go further, not only the reforms that took place since Maidan, during your government, during the government after you, and all the different governments since the Revolution of Dignity, but I would even say that the wartime and the unity that came through the wartime allowed agreement on reforms that were very difficult before, that you actually coalesced on some very difficult, and we are demanding, I realize that, and there has been, the Rada stepped up in an incredible way. The government, the Rada, the Rada is a lawmaking machine that has managed to really take some difficult and extraordinary steps. And for the individual members of the Rada to vote on things that have direct impact on them is not easy, and it was done. And so I think that we will see how far the EU accession will become part of any discussions about the end of the war. But what I can tell you is that there is recognition in the EU and determination that Ukraine needs to be part of the EU coming out of this. I think that's very clear to everybody. But it's not going to be a pretty process. I mean, there are going to be ups and downs. There is no question to that. And I would even say, I already mentioned in the previous intervention that we need Ukraine for our own defense. But I think that Ukraine has more things to offer to Europe. Mario Draghi came out with this competitiveness report recently and has identified something that's been identified before, and it's a problem in Europe that some commentators describe as too sclerotic. We have an innovation gap. We have a digital gap, right? And those are two gaps that Ukraine can really help cross and fill these gaps, because whether we talk about defense innovation or whether we talk about the innovation even in old technologies, just the spirit that you have here. I moved from, well, doesn't matter where I moved from. I moved to a country, I was joking, I moved here for the services, because when you ask a Ukrainian, is this possible? They say, of course it's possible. You have other countries where you ask, is this possible? You get a no as the first response. So I think you know what I'm talking about, right? And so I think that there is more of a recognition that it's actually mutually reinforcing, but the size of Ukraine, the innovation, the spirit of it is also scary to many people. So of course it's going to be not easy. Just like when Spain was coming in, the French and Italian wine industry was going to collapse. When Poland was coming in and Czech Republic, the German truckers and French plumbers were going to collapse. So there is always nervousness about who's going to come in, but that can be overcome. Which leads me to forgetting what was the second question you asked.
About the level of democracy, do you have any concerns?
Well, look, martial law by definition is a curb on democratic rights. There is no question about that, and the war is the justification, and under any, we can't go on the street after 12 or whatever other, you don't hold elections under the martial law. And those are legitimate. When imposing martial law, of course, you have to make sure that it's not undue restrictions, right? That they're justified, that they are valid, and that's what we've been saying. But if you are asking me whether we are asking for elections to be held right now, I just want to make very clear the EU is not asking for elections to be held right now, because we don't think that's, first of all, for us to say. The Ukrainian constitution is very clear, and all the reasons that led to the imposition of the martial law are still valid. And if somebody doesn't want to believe it, it's enough to be at one of the shooting ranges like last night at 10 o'clock when I don't know how many shaheeds over Kyiv were shot down. So the situation is certainly not warranting right now lifting of the martial law.
Thank you so much. Mr. Turner, the war itself changed during these 3 years. So what lessons has NATO learned from this ongoing war in the middle of Europe?
So we just opened a joint NATO-Ukraine center in Poland at the beginning of the week, precisely with the purpose of learning lessons, both military lessons but also non-military lessons, across government resilience and so on. And I would say, that the main point is there are an extraordinary number of lessons to learn from this extraordinary country. So some of them are lessons that you've learnt the very hard way during 3 years of all-out war. But some of them, frankly, are lessons that stem from Ukraine's innovation, creativity, just spirit. We can do rather than we can't do. So there's a massive amount for us to learn. So I hesitate, particularly with General PETRAEUS on the stage, to start saying here are some military lessons that we've learnt, but the development and use of drones of all kinds, short range, long range, making the front line almost a no-go zone, that has moved at extraordinary speed. The development of the threat of the opportunity of electronic warfare. I think it's sobering, I would say, to see the scale of land power being employed. So President Zelensky a few days ago talked about, I'm not sort of verifying these figures, but he talked about 110 Ukrainian brigades, 220 Russian brigades, taking into account a Russian build-up which is going on at the moment, and then 80 brigades in NATO Europe. I think we'd say that the figure is rather higher than that, but you're talking about extraordinary amounts of sheer manpower and land power, and probably there are some difficult conclusions about some types of platforms. So, some of the platforms that General PETRAEUS was talking about, overly vulnerable, overly heavy, overly slow, overly visible platforms. So what does that mean? And then General PETRAEUS talked about, the technology of tomorrow being employed today rather than the sort of normal paradigm of the technology of yesterday being employed tomorrow or today. I think the challenge of, speed of innovation and what you've seen in terms of from thought to use on the battlefield in a small number of weeks, that's a massive challenge to the way that we do business. So, we're not going to be moving away from large-scale, highly capable platforms which take many years to develop and produce, but it's clear that we're going to need to think very differently in future. And I think, the gap between what has been done and learnt here and where in some cases we are is a large gap. So we very much need to close that gap. So we're very grateful to Ukrainian colleagues for what we're learning from them, and there's a lot more that we need to learn from them.
Thank you. And at the end of the day, Mr. Yatsenyuk, are we closer now to just peace than we were 3 years ago? And let me ask you another $1 billion question. Is the victory of Ukraine still possible? Not the ceasefire, not the peace deal, but the victory.
Well, in my humble opinion, the victory for the Ukrainian people is that we're going to preserve the Ukrainian state. And this will happen undoubtedly, just undoubtedly. Look, we have to realize what's happening right now on the ground. Putin is bluffing, and I want to be very clear about this. Ukrainian men and women in the uniform severely degraded Russian military. Half of Russian military land forces have been demolished. Russia is running out of its Soviet stockpiles completely. Russian security and intelligence apparatus have been severely compromised. Our NATO friends and Ukrainian military are students and experts of the Russian tactics and what's going on in the Russian army. Due to the sanctions, Russia is on the brink of financial disaster. Look, I don't want to exaggerate. Russia still has enormous resources. We have to live in the real world. Russia still has a huge human resources. But compare Russia 3 or 5 years ago with the Russia nowadays. It's completely two different Russias. Whether Russia posed the threat to NATO member states similar as it was 3 years ago. I am not general and military expert, Ambassador, neither a NATO expert, but I strongly believe that yes, it doesn't pose any strong danger for neither the United States nor the NATO member states. So it's completely different Russia. And the thing is that that's what Ukrainian military have done with your support. Okay. So once again, it's a poker game. The guy is bluffing. And for us, it's a chess game. And in this chess game, we have to be smart, creative, bold, innovative. And we need to stand our ground. Putin is a war criminal, and if someone believes different, we have to say this. Russia is to pay the price. We have to say this. Even New York Post today, actually on the front page, made this kind of similar statement. So if you fight for the values, you will always win and you will always prevail. Yes, there is some kinds of ups and downs. But let's put aside emotions. To wrap up, there is a huge sense of unity inside the Ukrainian society. Against all the odds, could you imagine any nation that went through this kind of drama and trauma, and people still believe that we're going to prevail? People still believe that we will preserve our country. People still believe that Russia is to pay the price. People are fighting at the front and helping the front inside the country. So that's unprecedented. And at this watershed and pivotal moment, what we need just to act. We need to stay united with our European friends, with our American friends, inside with our NATO member states. So we have to be very decisive. And my take is that the time will come when Ukraine is to prevail in this war. The time will come when Ukraine is to become EU member and NATO member. We are fighting for this. Thank you.
Let the force be with us. Mr. Turner, you have a small remark, as I know, so please. But
Yeah, very short.
Very short.
I've thought of a couple of other things to add to the list. Air defense obviously matters. And in this city, you do air defense in the most extraordinary way. So NATO allies are extremely interested in how you do it here, the high-tech to the low-tech effective. Long-range strike capabilities really matter. And both of these requirements are, reflected in the next set of NATO capability targets. Logistics really matter. Sheer rates of industrial production really matter. So, one of the quotes that we do is that, across NATO, we can produce in a year what Russia on ammunition can produce in 3 months, and that's just Russia. So just one country. So we need to step up massively.
Thank you all of you for this honest conversation, but first of all, most of all, for your support in Ukraine. Дякую всім дуже за участь сьогодні. На жаль, у нас уже
Thank you very much for your participation. Unfortunately, our time is up. Well, I've confirmed the stereotype about journalists being liars because we overtook our time. Now let's go to next door for networking. Thank you very much for being here. And I hope that we will not have to discuss the 4th anniversary of war, but rather we'll be discussing the first anniversary of Ukraine's victory. Thank you very much.